Okay, great. Well, yes, so I'm Paramabandhu. This is Eugene. I haven't worked that out already. So first of all, just say it's really nice to be with you here this evening, and hello to those of you who are tuning in online. Yeah, it feels like a real special event to be interviewing Eugene about his book. I'm just going to say a couple of words about Eugene. He used to work as a sound engineer in soul music, British soul music, I believe.
Yeah.
That's right. And then later he changed direction and qualified as a therapist, particularly specialising in family work in families of adoption. So not the easiest work at all. And then went on to set up the Black, African and Asian Therapist Network. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's his background. He's also mitra involved with the London Buddhist Centre, been involved for quite a long time, and recently asked for ordination as well. So now training for ordination. So hope to see you in the order before too long. That would be very, very good. So yeah, I really enjoyed reading the book, and was very touched that Surya Gupta asked me if I would interview Eugene on the book. So that's what I'm going to be doing. I'll try and leave time at the end for questions, and if you're online and you want to ask something to Eugene, just put a little thing in the chat box and maybe put a Q next to it so that it's clear that it's a question, and Hyril, who is looking after the tech, will indicate to me towards the end if there are questions, and we'll try and do that. But before I start asking you questions, you're going to lead us in a little exercise.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you for that introduction as well. Feels really, I feel honoured to be here and to be presenting my book. But I wanted to first, get people to reflect on before the raised conversation, because I'll be speaking and I'll be using loads of words and terms, some of which might be triggering, some might not be, some might be very welcomed. And for me, I think there's it's just like a lot of things in life, just kind of preparing yourself almost for the journey. And we could just dive straight in, but I also know that certainly the race construct, the racism, the things that are happening in the world have a sort of underlying trauma attached to them. So I sort of see this as trauma work, really. So the first thing to really do is to attend to where trauma kind of lands, and it tends to land in our bodies first. And then we might have some thoughts about that. But it's very rarely that we think first and then our bodies react. So I think we'll go for the body first kind of idea. So I'm just going to invite everyone to, not necessarily get into meditation posture or anything, but just to find a nice seated position where you are and feel relaxed. So it's just going to be a couple of minutes. So the invitation is to sort of turn inwards. You can keep your eyes open or close them, but yeah. So I'll talk us through a kind of an exploration. Now, you woke up this morning, you may or may not have thought about this presentation, but you might have certainly thought about it as you walked in and had it announced to you that this is what we'll be doing. And I'd imagine that you'd have had a reaction even before we start to speak. And so the invitation is to maybe to get in touch with the before the conversation and what's happening before we even start, and how I think that's really important. So I want you to start off with the body and your sensations, and just tuning into, I don't know, what's happening there. What are you experiencing before we start the conversation? There may be a mixture of excitement or apprehension, perhaps. Again, just trying to sort of move away from those concepts and just see if you can get to the raw sensations, the heartbeat. What's going on in the stomach? Tension or relaxation. In the breath. And just noticing what is in your awareness. And there may not be anything. It may be a kind of a sort of dullness, perhaps, or a numbness. And just to note it, that's what it is. And then moving into our emotional life, the feelings. What feelings come to mind when I say the race conversation? And then just having a broad awareness really of that experience, and maybe labeling it if you can. And then letting go of the attention to feeling and just noticing whether that's possible. And then just maybe attending to your thoughts. The quality of your thoughts. So are they self-deprecating, confused, unsure? And again, just logging, putting a label to those experiences. Okay, so we're going to end pretty soon, just to prepare you to come back into the room, and just holding on to the experience of your body, your emotions, and your cognitive life. I needed that, if no one else did.
I don't know whether I did or whether I prefer to be in denial and just not feel my feelings. So,
yeah. I mean, it's not necessarily with race, but many things. It's just worth. Some people have a preoccupation in the mind about stuff, or sort of preoccupation with feeling or the body or something. There's loads going on, and I guess the invitation. I'm making the invitation to stay less with the thinking and the working out and trying to work it out, because I think well, I've had an experience of trying to work it out, and there is no answer to hate and greed and delusion as such. So it's just so the invitation is to sort of stay with a sort of embodied experience of what you're experiencing. And some might feel very connected to what I'm saying, and some might say, "What are you talking about?" But again, we're just sort of moving into that. This invitation is to stay with those kind of embodied connections, because I've had a lot of conversations with people around race and trying to stay with the subject can be a challenge, and often we kind of feel unresourced, to say the least, in that staying with it, and our tendency is to kind of move away from discomfort, as we all know. And certainly for me, my journey of meditation has been sort of integral, really, to even writing anything like this. So that was kind of very, very important to me to be able to come back to my body, to kind of come back to my ethical centre, and sort of write with kindness and sort of positive intention.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good way of coming out of the head and the proliferation of unhelpful thoughts, isn't it, to feel one's body. But so you were saying that, that's been quite important in writing the book. So, I mean, in a way to start thinking about the book, can you say a bit about what led you to write such a book? How did that come about? I'm a therapist, and I think it mainly came from the training of psychotherapists, and I guess just like Buddhism to some degree, you're required to explore your identity or various identities as you're going through the training process to become a psychotherapist. You need to be able to be robust enough in your own identities to kind of work with other people, and that's encouraged on the course. You're encouraged to self-disclose and to be vulnerable with other people in the space, and that's part of the training. And certainly, but for a lot of the therapists in training of colour, for them, or for some of them at least, the bit they're sort of where they felt suffering a lot or the most was around their racial identity, and so they're offered this space to talk about whatever it is they want to talk about, and maybe naively perhaps they kind of enter into the spirit of disclosure, but for some it was a very difficult experience, because what most people would experience is silence, or people not quite knowing how to respond, or even that they should respond. And there was a kind of for some people it was a re-traumatization of their experience. And I then decided that I would create kind of forums or thinking spaces. I call them recovering your thinking spaces around the race conversation for trainers, people who were training therapists. So it doesn't matter who they are; they could be from any ethnicity. But it was very mixed. We had white therapists, black therapists, Asian therapists. So it was really mixed. But they all came with the intention of trying to respond in the moment to racial distress, or people talking about it, kind of saying something about it. Yeah, so that, and what was unique about everyone who turned up was that they had an experience. They had an experience that had impacted them. And we've got
sleeper there. And so basically what they would have experienced is, I don't know, just the discomfort of really being in the space with someone when they're talking about those issues. And it was very distressing for people to be able to not be able to respond. You know, it's like, you know, you trained as a psychotherapist for 20 years and this is your job. And for the people who were training, they just felt not unable to respond in that moment. They sort of froze and kind of got confused or overwhelmed. So it was, so they came not really knowing what they needed. They kind of just came because they just wanted to figure this thing out. So they'd come to a place where they couldn't really. There was a before and an after. So there was a before where it was like, okay, well I could meet this if it came. You know, if someone talked about their racial identity, yeah, I could do this. You know, and then they found that they couldn't. And that experience kind of just landed with them. They had, so it was almost like the world had changed almost. It was almost as if the world that they once knew, or the way that they saw themselves, had kind of just completely changed. And there was like working in a completely different paradigm now. The world was different. And then they just needed to orientate themselves to this kind of new reality. And it feels like a really, you know, there are big experiences that people go through. And it's, you know, and you know, I definitely feel that some of the trainers who came were trainers of colour as well, so they were also going through a similar process. So there's something very similar about how people go through this.
And it sounds like there's something a bit surprising for people to notice that, you know, they thought it wouldn't be a problem,
yeah,
and then to discover, oh, actually, it's not straightforward at all. And that seems like that was quite surprising for people.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And what did we do? Well, you know, we just sat. People wanted to teaching. They wanted, okay, what do I do? What do I say? You know, and they wanted a narrative that they could kind of employ that would make it work. And but there'd been a lot of training, you know, before, and that doesn't seem to do the job. So what I was interested in was people just becoming, more comfortable in a slightly different reality, or, you know, somehow the world had changed, and that their bodies actually were becoming more accustomed to the feelings that were going on, and the thoughts that were happening and the sensations that were taking place. And there was a sort of process of unfreezing, kind of being able to move a little bit more, being able to think more clearly. So it became less about, well, you need to say this, or you need to say that, or you need to use these words, or you need to use that word. And it became more about connecting with the topic, and having your mind still free. And it's just like any distress that's in front of you, you know, you just naturally, you know, as humans, we just naturally kind of just do the right thing around people's distress. You know, we don't think about it. We don't think, oh, I'm going to say this, or I'm going to do that. They just do it. And then they might have some thoughts about it later. So, but it seems like for race, that natural process of engagement with distress and a compassionate response is kind of blocked almost. There's something that's blocking that.
So what do you think goes on there? Why do you think it gets blocked in this particular area? You know, particularly given, you know, we're talking about people who are psychotherapists, who are, you know, trained in self-awareness and trained in responding to distress. So particularly in that group of people.
Yes.
What's going on there?
Well, I mean, they're living in the same world as everyone else, aren't they? So, it's a difficult question to answer, but especially in the time we've got. But what I would say is that let me just sit with it for a little bit. Maybe the analogy is with, because I used to work with adoption and adopted children and their families. And during that work, I learned a lot about trauma and how people respond to traumatized people. And the adoptive thing is quite a unique kind of space, really, because as an adoptive parent, you're not that this child isn't born to you, so they just sort of come to you, and you've got your identity as a parent and as a good person, kind of there to kind of give to the world this gift. It's not always like that, but quite often there is that sort of process of being connected to the world in that way and wanting to give back to a child, wanting to support them and to be, being good adults in the future. And there was a lot going on there that was challenging for parents, certainly the families that came to me, at least. And what the difficulty was that the child who came to their home would normally come in with, especially if they were adopted in the UK, that they've had this sort of intergenerational experience. So their parents would have been traumatized in some way, and they would have sort of passed that trauma down. And then their grandparents were also, once you start to look at the pattern, you start to see that there is this kind of actually quite a long line of intergenerational trauma that's happened. And then this package of intergenerational trauma is just sort of sitting on your lap, basically. And the really difficult part of that is that there's sometimes a child will be very nice to strangers and people, people if you know about this, they'll be very nice to strangers. But then when they'd come home to the parental figure, they'd be rejecting of that parental figure, and so all of those kind of dynamics made it really, really hard to parent. And I saw a lot of that, working in that kind of dynamic, I saw a lot of that kind of dynamic happening within the race conversation as well. So there is this, in the race, there is this intergenerational trauma that's just sort of sitting in our bodies. And it sort of comes through, it's sitting there, we don't know it's there, it's just part of the world. And I think that's kind of, and I think it's that gets triggered for us, just like for the child. What the trigger for the child would be this parent, a parent figure. That's the trigger. So it could be any parent. It doesn't really matter who you are. But people do take it very personally, and they obsess about themselves and their role and how they haven't done very well, and maybe they need to do more. And there's this kind of rumination around stuff. And again, that's the same with race. You have the conversation, and then there's this preoccupation with the self. How I'm doing, my identity, who am I, who are you? And all of a sudden the distress is kind of sort of parcelled over here, and we're engaged in something else other than looking at the distress. And in adoption, it's very similar. Can we move those things aside and focus on the distress? And if you can manage that, the relationship actually can really start to, there's a connection. So that's the challenge. I think we've been trained over the generations not to respond to race distress. It's just part and parcel of how we are. On every level, we're just not invited to do it. And then when we're invited to do it, we're kind of like, I just don't know how. Yeah, it's almost as if it almost feels as if you're doing something wrong, or you're kind of crossing a boundary, which you're not supposed to, because you're not really supposed to do that, and everyone looks at each other, wondering what to say. And in the meantime, and then with it not kind of being met, it's just allowed to continue in the imagination of people, the imagination of the individual. So that's what makes it so difficult. It's kind of just the past. I mean, if you're a therapist, every therapist knows that the past is kind of central to how people are in the present. So it's the past coming back and us living out past relationships around black and white people, I guess.
Yeah. One of the things I was struck by in your book is you go into quite a lot you've got a whole chapter on history.
Yeah.
Which is, I was going to say interesting, but it makes for quite, in a way, shocking sort of reading.
Yeah.
And in a way, you're sort of alluding to that in what you were responding to just now. I mean, for you writing the book, was that an area you had to sort of look into more, or it's obviously played an important part of your thinking in terms of writing the book?
That was the hardest part, I think.
Right.
The research for that. I did a lot of reading, and a lot of it was like, well, what am I not going to include? I think that was, but because I wanted to kind of make it straightforward and simple, and I didn't want to sort of complicate things too much, and people take a general sense of the history and the reasons why the history is important. But during the course of writing that particular chapter, I think internally, my pattern is to kind of shut down. But every single book I read or a pamphlet, there's just a smaller shutting down, which I didn't really realise. I didn't realise until I made a video for this conference called Witnessing the Wound, and it's kind of just a sort of narrative of slavery, colonialism, and indentured labour and all that. And so I presented it to everyone, and everyone was horrified and shocked, and it's like, what the? And I was just sitting there, just playing it as if it was just a regular video.
Yeah.
And so their shock was kind of like, oh, okay, what does that mean exactly? So I clearly shut down my distress response. So I had to kind of recover that. I had to so it was a bit of a shock. It was a shock.
And again, I guess that's a sort of difficult thing to negotiate, isn't it? Because on the other hand, you don't want to just get into horrified anxiety.
No.
I mean, it's a sort of the classic thing when we're trying to develop compassion as Dharma practitioners is we're trying to stay away from, on the one hand, horrified anxiety, but also from just cutting off. So I can imagine that, that was quite a tricky thing to navigate.
I mean, because I'd already done that several times before, and I think but this time around it was different because I was presenting it to someone else. I was going to write something, and I think also at the time, maybe not particularly for that particular part, but it was COVID. There was lockdown. There was George Floyd killing in America. There was loads of things going on aside from my reading about this stuff. So I think that also kind of played a big part in kind of my sort of shutting down, sort of slow shutting down kind of process.
I suppose particularly with that killing, it's sort of maybe you could think a lot of the other stuff. I mean, a lot of the stuff in the book is about the past, which you can maybe conveniently compartmentalize into the past, but obviously that made it very much in the present. So
Yes.
It sort of hits home a bit more strongly.
Yeah, and I think I was aware, and I was just more conscious more more than anything really about, the past being reawoken. It was really, really strong for me, and strong for many people, who may not necessarily have had extremely strong racialized experiences. It's just sort of going about their everyday business, but something was awoken. Because in some ways, if I didn't know about that, because when that happened, I was elsewhere,
Right.
And I sort of came into it, not knowing. So, one moment I was okay, and the next moment I wasn't. So it's like, well, what's so different about 10 minutes ago than now? But it just goes to kind of show the power of the unconscious stuff that's in there in my body, kind of getting reawoken by the present triggers of this man I didn't know, but the story was there, and it kind of was enough to trigger me, and it triggered many other people as well. And it sort of created a world where it was really, really hard to have a race conversation beforehand, and now it seems like I can't get away from them. So everyone wants to talk about race now, and that has its own dynamic. It's like, I don't want to talk about it today. Thank you very much. But I think, but it goes to it goes to the power of this kind of unconscious body stuff that's just there. It's got nothing to do with our minds and what we're thinking half the time. It's just there.
This ties in with the whole theme of trauma that you again developed half a whole chapter on trauma that you've in a way touched on to already. But I think it's that sort of area, isn't it, where things are sort of held in the body that we may not be aware of. Yeah,
and the way I talk about it in the book is, I don't use the word conditioning, but it is called a conditioning over generations, isn't it? I sort of call it the race construct of race, and so it has many levels. So there are, the constructs of the sort of the narratives of race, who is deserving, who's not deserving, what you're supposed to do with this racial identity that you've got, and what you're supposed to do with this racial identity that you've got. So there's that kind of level, which is kind of superficial, I guess, but powerful at the same time. And then there's a kind of a body level, which is, it's the way we hold our bodies, the way we walk into a room, the way we look at each other, all of those kind of things, which are sort of most of our communication. So I've talked about call it the race conversation, but it's kind of a bit misleading in some ways, because it's not.
Well, you've almost got two conversations going on, haven't you? We've got the words going on, and then there's the whole body language going on. Yeah. So I'm more interested in that, the non-verbal conversation that people have, and a person of colour can come into a space and kind of almost like pick up the vibe very quickly. I'm not sure about this, and sort of move out or do something about that, or so whether someone has spent time thinking about their own racial identity or not, that's picked up really in a heartbeat by people who think a lot about this, or not, or even don't think a lot about it. They just kind of just instinctively know that something's not right. And it depends on how important their racial identity is as well to them. Right. So there's loads of dynamics here, but I wanted to focus on the non-verbal kind of communication, and kind of say how important that is to how we communicate race, how we communicate how we are. In the normal field of trauma, just regular trauma theory would suggest that the way that we
the way that we are in our bodies, whether we kind of feeling comfortable, we're feeling connected to our bodies and feeling connected to our thoughts. What might be termed regulated, a sort of regulated person, will just naturally respond to whatever's out there in a very sort of natural way. They respond to distress, respond to stress, respond to laughter and joy, and those kinds of things like that. But what they're communicating when they're feeling regulated is safety. Just sort of raw safety. I'm feeling safe now, and but the race conversation often brings people to a kind of a place in their bodies where they don't feel safe, and when they don't feel safe, they actually start to communicate kind of signs of danger to other people. So there's a kind of communication of danger almost, and we pick that up very, very quickly. If someone doesn't feeling okay, and then we start to reorientate to where the danger is, because we're all connected and we all want to, as group animals, we want to kind of signal to the herd that there's danger right down the road. So it's it's on that level, which is quite, you can't really do that much about. You can't really access it directly. You can't say, "Oh, I don't want to feel unsafe right now," and just something happens. So you have to approach it indirectly. Yeah. And
so you've got all that stuff about history, you've got all that stuff about trauma and how that's communicated on the body. The other thing I was struck by in the book in terms of what can make it difficult is the whole emphasis you mentioned about shame as opposed to guilt. So shame not in the sense of Buddhists sometimes use shame in a positive sense in terms of hri, but shame in a negative sense of feeling shamed about oneself. Which from my time as a psychiatrist, I've certainly picked up on that particular work of Paul Gilbert and compassion-focused therapy, because he recognised shame was that sort of negative shame was so important in, for example, depression and other disorders. So I was interested to notice that you'd picked up on that as being an issue that can emerge in the race conversation. I wondered if you say anything about that.
Yes, I've decided to give it a race construct, shame, and I wanted to kind of I think people can be friends and they can have really strong positive relationships with each other, but as soon as race comes into the picture, as soon as someone talks about race, I think sometimes those relationships can feel very fragile very, very quickly. And so I don't want to say that people are always in these states. I think people move from one state to the next very, very smooth, based on what's going on. So if race isn't being talked about, discussed, then I think people can get on with their lives and everything's kind of feels like it's okay. Once that comes into the field, something happens and it kind of changes. And what tends to happen is that people get preoccupied with their identity, who they are as people. Am I a good person? Am I not a good person? And they have they may have a conception of themselves as a good person, and then they might do something, say something, be something that completely contradicts their own version of themselves. So they're sort of left with a bit of a conundrum here about, well, who am I exactly? Am I this person I think I am, or am I this other person who's not responding very well? And that can bring quite a lot of shame to people. It's kind of they feel that they let themselves down, or they're not responding in the way that they would want to respond, and they almost have to sort of start to reorganize what they think about themselves, who they are. And sometimes the relationship can get quite rocky and maybe even break, and the threat of the relationship breaking is kind of feels real to people. So Yeah, so I think shame is quite an important thing, and people do say, certainly in the forums that I run, that shame was a big thing that they were experiencing.
And both for black people and for white people.
Yeah. For black people, the shame is about not being able to respond.
Yeah.
In a particular way when something is going on that they need to challenge. I need to challenge this, but they don't for whatever reason, and then they feel like they've let themselves down. They've let their community down. They've done. There's so much that they can get into, and they start to have this internalized shame. And for white people, it's kind of the same. It's a slightly different angle, but same process of not being good enough.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by this thing that you mentioned, which I think other writers have talked about, this easy to fall into a binary of, either I'm a bad racist person or I'm a good person who couldn't possibly be racist in any way.
Yeah.
And so if there's anything that threatens, some kind of prejudice or something that you could act in wrongly or something like that, then it's danger of putting you into the bad camp. And of course, we don't want that.
No, we don't want that.
We want to be the nice person.
And of course, the way we're talking about it is if where it's all in the mind. But of course, it's if there's a threat to the relationship, you're going to feel a sense of danger. And once you start feeling a bit of danger, and our minds don't think very clearly in danger. What they tend to do is they focus on the things that aren't working very well. They tend to focus on the things that are wrong, because we want to be able to attend to those wrong things to make it right so that we can feel safe again. And then our minds go to the wrong things, and we get very binary about our experience. It's either good or bad, safe or not safe. So it all starts with the body, and then we have this kind of mind experience of what's happening. Sort of hence my kind of, we could stay here and try to work it out here, but it doesn't feel like, to me, well, certainly my own personal experience is that just makes it even worse if I stay here and I need to drop down. So my invitation into sort of a mindful approach to the body experience as we go through the conversation, or the thought of a conversation, or something that happened 2 weeks ago that you're feeling a little bit bad about. So to stay away from too much proliferation around it, and to kind of maybe drop down into the body. Yeah.
So, as in many things in what we talk about in Buddhism, that sort of responding mindfully in that way can make a real difference.
Yeah. When I was first thinking about it, that was the could a mindful approach to this really support people to stay with the process? And I think to some extent I think it's true. I think it's true of many distresses, so I think it's also equally true of racial distress as well. Yeah. I hope so.
Let's hope so. Well, I think you've you certainly argue for it very eloquently. You were asking me, we were having a meal together earlier, and you asked me, how I sort of responded to the book, and I was saying a couple of the things that I responded to, which I thought would be good to maybe talk a little bit more about, was one was the thing of sort of just being a white person, that I can be a trigger for somebody of colour, sort of unthinkingly, without, not that I've necessarily done anything in particular, but just by the fact of being white, or appearing white. Actually, I'm quarter African. But you wouldn't know that. No, I wouldn't know. But because I appear white, then I can be a trigger unthinkingly. What should I do? What can I do?
I mean, on one level it doesn't make sense, but on another level it makes sense. There's there's been a long struggle of gender oppression, isn't there? And the construct of gender, and trying to address the inequalities of the gender binary thing. So, we know if a woman's being abused, beaten up, domestic abuse, men become kind of a difficult thing to, a difficult area to be around.
Sure.
So it does make sense that person of colour experience is from a white hostility. So as a white skin, you would have a particular resonance. But again, I think that's often conditional. It could be that things are okay, but when the race conversation starts, then it becomes more clear that we've got this difference, and then it becomes more of a trigger.
Sure.
So it's not something that it's not a kind of like a thing that's just going to happen. There's conditionality to all of these things. So what to do? I mean, what did we do in the FWBO? Well, we decided to have men's communities, women's communities to work on our conditioning. I think that was the original conception. And then when we come back together again, so that we're free to explore things we need to do around the house and around whatever, unencumbered by the fact that there's this other gender there who's just going to come in and do it on your behalf. So I don't think there's much you could do about the trigger, but there is something that can be done about the response.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're in relationships, we often we trigger each other all over the place, don't we? Leave the toilet seat up, all kinds of stuff is going on. But then if you say, I can't be bothered with that toilet seat, I'm just gonna leave it the way I like it. There's gonna be a problem, isn't there? But so you might respond. The way that you respond kind of actually creates connection. These misattunements that happen all the time between people, and then there's like a kind of a response which kind of makes actually the relationship actually stronger. So it does have the potential to be re-triggering and for things to just continue as they've always done, but it's also an opportunity to respond in a particular way to actually create a different kind of relationship. So it is an opportunity as well as a...
I suppose there's something about trying to be alive to that.
Yeah.
That possibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, another area sort of in a way, it's sort of a bit related to that. I was thinking it comes under the, again, that we mentioned earlier, under the thing of white privilege. So in a way, the idea that in certain situations in somewhere like Britain, as a white person, that I won't have to think about certain issues that if I was coloured, that I might have to think about. I mean, the thing which I'd be interested in your response to was sort of, I was trying to make sort of connections we have in the Dharma, and one of the connections I was thinking was the intoxication. So you got this idea of intoxication with youth, intoxication with wealth, intoxication with health. So, for example, when we're healthy, it's easy to forget that we can get ill, and we just take our health as completely for granted.
Yes.
And I was thinking in a way maybe there's something similar or analogous to that in terms of being white, and you don't read it because it's just like how it is, that you don't expect to be discriminated against, or you feel like you've got a right to be in a situation. You're not entering it with a certain kind of nervousness that you might do for people of colour. So does that kind of speak to you?
Yeah, it does, and I think it's difficult to see. It's difficult to see privilege, isn't it? I mean, even as a man, you have to work at you have to work at it to kind of see, you know what I mean? Even though everyone else, all the women around you are telling you this, that, the other, kind of, it's their problem, then sort it out. And you have to sort of work at it, because you don't want to see the ways in which you're privileged in society. And I know as a man I'll be able to do X, Y, Z. As a woman, it's just more challenging. And it's similar with race. But the privilege. I mean, it's a funny one, isn't it? Because privilege means that you've got more stuff. You've got more. You personally have got more. But it's not really. It's the actual term. I mean, all these terms to some degree are kind of. It's a bit like Buddhism in some ways. They're just like little kind of ways of looking at the world that make sense in that moment, that kind of move you along in a certain direction. And so this particular concept, this idea of white privilege, is that that there's a privilege not to be able to, there's a privilege of not engaging with the sort of messy business of race. You don't have to do. The privilege, you can either engage or not engage. That's your privilege. As a person of colour, it's harder to do that. But it's also other privileges as well. I mean, someone called Peggy McIntosh wrote an article about white privilege, and it had a list of all the privileges. One of which was you don't need to worry when your child goes to school that they'll be racially abused, or you don't need to. There's this whole long list of kind of things that we worry about. We worry about our children. We worry about their safety. We worry about our partner's safety. We worry about men going out in the street. So all of that is kind of not. There's a privilege of not having to go through all of that. And of course there are, if you look at society as a whole, the tendency is for the wealth to sort of be moving over to the white end. So but I think people think about it in those kind of terms, money terms. I don't have a big mansion. I don't have, you know what I mean? That's how people tend to think of privilege. But it's actually the privilege, I think, is at its most basic, is the privilege of just not having to deal with it.
Yeah. Which is rather convenient.
Very convenient.
So I'm just going to ask you one more question, then I'll open it up. So we can have a couple of questions from the floor and from online. But so here we are, we're at Dharma Night. With this wonderful book. What's the relevance for people who are practicing the Dharma? Because here we've got people practicing the Dharma. Why should they read this book?
Good question. I guess we're all here working on conditioning, aren't we? On our conditioning and kind of overcoming, or at least exploring, and I think there's all kinds of conditioning that we're working with. We're working with our family condition, our family of origin, that system, gender oppression, gender. The constructs of social gender and all those kind of things, and I think race is just one of those areas which actually affects a lot of the world. I mean, the way I see it is that, I mean, I've often thought about, well, what's the reason for the race construct? Why is it there? There must be some function to it. There must be some reason why it's there. It just feels like it's just something that's just there and we just get on with it. And I'm sure it's kind of maybe not super explicit, but I think it is there in the book that the one of the reasons for the race construct was to kind of create the conditions whereby people could sort of hold on to the resources. It's about how do I get resources, how do I store them in my cupboard, and how do I put a gate on it. And the race construct was a convenient way of creating the conditions whereby that could continue. So you had an in-group, an out-group.
Yeah.
There's a lot of resources in the places where people of colour would normally come from. And so to me, that's the reason for it. And I think that has also created a particular world that we're living in. And I think race is very connected, I think, to how we use resources generally in the world and how we're using the Earth's resources. And so, I mean, there's lots of connections between that and how the planet and how we're using the planet.
So for Dharma practitioners who are trying to go beyond greed and craving,
it's
very relevant.
It's very relevant. Not so much. It may not be necessarily relevant for individual people because they're not going through it.
Yeah.
But in terms of creating an environment where people feel connected, warm, they sort of feel that they matter, that their distress matters, that they actually. So I think it's really important to engage at that level. And I think as Buddhist practitioners, we're all trying to get to sort of move beyond delusion and try to get to truth of people's experiences so that we can kind of meet them in some way. And racial conditioning is a challenge. Trying to unravel it is a really, really big challenge. But it's a challenge that also has knock-on effects. For me personally, I've started to engage in other kinds of oppression that not necessarily related to me, and sort of become an ally of other oppressed groups. So there's a kind of sort of moving beyond as well of that. So it's not necessarily just about dealing with this, but there's a kind of moving beyond into something new, bigger.
Great. So I'm just going to open up for a little bit for just for a few minutes for see if there are any questions. So maybe I'll start in the room and then I'll see if there are any questions outside the room. So in the room, does anybody want to put a question to Eugene?
Thank you, Eugene. I have a sort of I won't say devil's advocate question, but I suppose something that comes up in Buddhist context sometimes when race is discussed, and I think it's like the near enemy of what we're talking about. But I think it's my perception of it. But I really my question is, I'd like to hear what you think about it. Is the idea that if we as Buddhists engage in sort of anti-racist work, that we're sort of trying to, I guess, something about relating to samsara using its own constructs, and surely we're here because we're trying to kind of overcome our conditioning in those, so rather than sort of solidifying around here I am as a white woman, there you are as a black man, etc. Rather than that, surely shouldn't be we in a sort of post-racial, that kind of thing. And it just, I sort of have my own views about that, but I wondered, having both the Buddhist practitioner in you and kind of having explored this and written the book, I wondered what your thoughts would be about actually why this is really important to turn towards and to have the race conversation, to relate to it before we can perhaps let go of all of those identities altogether.
I mean, we all have. There's this, sort of the ideal, isn't there, of how we'd like to be, and then there's a sort of reality of how things actually are. And I think in order to move beyond it, I think you do need to engage with it as it is. You have to sort of really engage with it in its own terms to sort of start off with. Not that you stay there forever, but that's a starting place. And then once you start there, and then something happens, and then there may be a possibility of moving beyond that. But just to sort of jump into the ideal feels like you just sort of one step too quick to get to where you want to get to.
Sort of bypassing
Yeah, it's a wrong view, but you're kind of using it in the sort of in the service of trying to get to right view in some way. You know, you kind of if that, I don't know if that kind of answers, or yeah.
So let's just see if we got any questions online here.
Yeah. So Vijaya Chitta says, as a mother asking a father, how did the murder of George Floyd influence your process in writing this book?
Sorry, say that again. As a mother, sorry.
Vijaya Chitta says, a mother asking a father, and then she says, Eugene, how did the murder of George Floyd influence your process in writing the book?
I mean, the book had already been written when, or mostly written, but when it happened. It would have been interesting. It might have been a different book. I mean, to me, it's sort of like it was like a grenade had gone off, I think, and I was sort of trying to hold my ears, and my ears were ringing, and I was kind of so. That was my sort of personal process around it, and it took a long time for my body to settle. And there was a mini version of that whilst I was actually writing this. The Grenfell, it was Grenfell Tower, was going on. Those were the kinds of things that were happening at the time when I was actually writing, which was quite a long time ago. But yeah, that was my experience as the actual murder itself. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Eugene. Thank you for being so honest and open, and it's, a difficult area to talk about. And well, you've written a book that helps us to do that.
Yeah.
So there's a chance to buy the book. We've got copies outside. It's very readable. I really enjoyed reading it. And yeah, maybe we could just thank Eugene.
Thank you.
So that's the end of the class. If you'd like to have a book signed by Eugene, he'll be very happy to do that. So, as I say, you can buy the book in the bookshop, and Eugene will be on one of the sofas, pen in hand, if you'd like a signed copy. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.